Hello, world. This is the Know Your Place podcast, and this is episode 43. And on this week's episode, I'm going to sort of talk about the ends of eras, because I think it's very interesting how they define the places they're in the moments in time. So stay tuned. The impetus for bringing up this topic is the recent passing of George H.W. Bush this weekend. I guess Sunday is it's December 2nd, 2018. So this today it happened this morning, I guess. But you'll probably be hearing this podcast in the future. So anyway, the reason why I talk about him and sort of say it's the end of an era is, he for all the outsiders who aren't Americans who listen to my podcast, he wasn't just a president. He was vice president under Reagan for his 2 terms, and before that, he was head of the CIA. And prior to that, he had been quite the stalwart in Texas politics. So it wasn't like he was a Johnny come lately. It wasn't like he just did this 1 term as president and that's all he's remembered for. No, he's remembered for a lot of things. And that is why I think his son, George W. Bush, had such an easy time winning when he ran in 2000. So, why do I say it's the end of an era? That's a pretty grand claim to claim that he was part of an era and then that it's come to its demise, is because the Bush political family now is essentially over, and they were one that had really shaped a certain way America was perceived, and in particular Texas has been perceived over the past few years. And this is also sort of ties in with John McCain too, who passed away this year, and I'll talk about him a little bit too. But they personified this. They were part of. George H.W. was part of the greatest generation, the generation that fought in World War II, and he personified what they did in government. And in a lot of ways, I know now people are very critical of their policies, but at the time in the 80s, and into the early 90s, it seemed like we were winning, or America was the good guys out conquering the evil in the world. Now, I don't want to make that presumption that that's how it's perceived anymore, but it was kind of perceived that way, right? Reagan goes out and says Gorbachev tear down this wall, but Germany reunifies under Bush's presidency, and he took a lot of flack for allowing German reunification to happen, or sort of tacitly supporting it, and that's sort of the legacy I'm talking about, the era that's ended. This era of sort of, and it was already on its way out. Like even during Obama's presidency, and even prior to that, at the later years of George W. Bush. I'll talk about this too when I talk about Clinton. It seems like now we can officially say that this era of America being perceived as the world police force is over, especially with some of the rhetoric our current president, Mr. Trump, has thrown around. Uh, so, why I say this is interesting is, does that mean sort of this style of politics of, well, we're trying to look like the good guy, but there's all kinds of underhanded dealings around us, and we're not really sure if any of these plans are working, but we really want to be perceived as the good guy on the outside. I mean, that is, a lot of people give both the Bushes a lot of flack, but his father in particular, George H.W. Bush, was really known for being seen as the nice guy. Like being seen as the negotiator, the guy that made everybody happy. And I guess that era for us is over. I mean, if you look at our current president and his rhetoric, you can't help but think that that era is over. And I don't know what to make of that. I mean, I've grown up as a kid seeing that on display, and I'm going to talk about Clinton here in a second, because that you can't talk about them and not talk about him. But I guess I kind of knew this era was. Part of me had thought that the Bush Dynasty of, supposed closet conservatives, trying to be seen on the outside as nice people, but want to intervene in all these wars and things. Part of me had thought that could still happen again. People don't forget how fast things move in the world and how fast perception changes, because they just see Trump now and all of that's gone. But they don't realize 2 years ago, around this time, 2 years and some months before, Jeb Bush was still a front runner for presidency. There was a chance that the Bush dynasty could continue. Now, granted, Trump killed him in that debate, but we don't know what would have happened if that didn't go down that way. And I think that's important to stress now, because with the father passing away and their mother gone, and Jeb having lost in the Republican primary in 2016, we can officially say that this era is over. They are no longer the Shakers that they were. Their family does not have the influence it did. And it's interesting. I don't really have a. I'm sure people want me to come out stridently, and I don't come out stridently when people pass on. I was a critic of a lot of policies of his son. Him, I'm not. I mean, I wasn't really alive for him being president, and my heritage is German, so I can't really say that I disagree with German reunification. But there are definitely things that people can criticize him for. He's not a blameless individual, especially with the way he sort of made the CIA as powerful as it is in our country now. So why do I think this is all important? That's just interesting comparisons of eras. So why I say that is, if you talk about also the Clinton era, uh, it got exciting and was over in a much faster period of time with Bill Clinton. He took over in '92 as some golden child, that was a shaker, changed things up, and then by 2001, after Gore, his vice president, having lost, and then September 11th happening, it was quite clear that Clinton was the era was gone. Nobody really thought about the Clintons anymore. And yeah, they won a Senate seat, and yeah, they were in a primary Hillary was in a primary in 2008 and 2016. But it just didn't. That whole election, to me, it seemed painfully clear that we were talking about a bygone era with them. And again, that was sort of like we we were interventionists, just like people are gonna get mad at me probably for saying this in the comments section, but I don't see a lot of difference between Bill and W Senior, other than the fact that W Senior was more experienced in federal government, whereas Clinton was more, famous for being governor of Arkansas and things. But on the outside, they really wanted to be America to be perceived as a great power in the world's police force, and trying to intervene and do the right thing all the time. And it constantly floundered. And this was on full display in that show they made about the presidency called The West Wing. They were modeling it after the Clinton White House. And these eras that are gone, while I am excited to no longer sort of be seen as the world's police force, or while I've been quite skeptical of the aims of these people that have been in charge, it does beg to question what the next era looks like in America, what we will look like going forward, what it will I don't know if that means a better era emerges. When the Roman Republic fell and Caesar was in charge, and then Caesar fell, they were very fortunate that Augustus emerged. And Augustus's reign, while it meant the end of the Republic as they knew it, it was a very good reign. Things were really looking up for Rome, and then it got so much worse after that. So it's the jury is really out on those kind of things. And I wanted to talk about a few other eras that I felt like were ending, that sort of defined that we're gonna. I mean, we've already started looking back on the Bush era, and it's already sort of part of the history books, and so is the Clinton era, because now we are we're starting to become about 2 decades removed. So we can do that now. You can get away with that. What'll be really interesting for me going forward is, Merkel has announced she is not seeking re-election, and she and the Grand Coalition have defined German politics now for since 2005 for, you know, over a decade. What will future Germany look like? Will it be one where they keep going in this direction of some perceived grand coalition of people working out for the grand best of Germany? And will Germany be the strongest power in Europe continuing going forward? And will it want to be perceived kind of like America as like a power, a hegemony, a great country with an overwhelming economy? Or will things start to slither away because of the different policies they have embraced as part of the EU and trying to leave their mark on the world? Uh, you know, that one will be really interesting to watch, and I think people should look out for it as time goes on. Uh, because I don't really know what to tell you what I think is going to happen. So anyway, yeah, those are some eras, and when I think of Merkel's Germany, I'm going to think of Germany really emerging as the strongest country in Europe for that decade. And I know my British listeners are going to be offended, and I know other people are going to be offended. But they won the World Cup again in 2014, and their economy has been by far the strongest for a while now in Europe, and I think that will really have defined him. Merkel's Germany will be defined that way, much like, when we had a huge upswing in America during Clinton's era in the early part of Clinton's era in the 90s. That's how we were defined. We were defined as America's back. America is strong, and that is how Trump's supporters right now want to see his presidency ultimately defined. But I don't think it's going to turn out that way for him, unfortunately. So yeah, there's a there's very interesting eras when we look at places, and I also guess while I'm at it, I'm going to bring up the Tony Blair era because I thought Tony Blair, and I'll also bring up Margaret Thatcher because I thought it was very interesting. I've been intertwined so much with a lot of United Kingdom British people, and they in a comment section, somebody said, "Who do people think of worse in their memory, Margaret Thatcher or Tony Blair?" Because there is a lot of disdain for both people from certain factions. But I found it very interesting to see that in a poll that was done recently, there was a 30% of the people polled, these British citizens, not only didn't like Tony Blair, because let's face it, a lot of people didn't like George W. Bush when he left office either. You know, they want him tried for war criminal activity for what happened in Iraq. That's bold. That is a really large disdain. I mean, it's not a majority. You'll never see any more criminal charges, but that is crazy. Not to say that I agree. I don't agree personally with a lot of interventionist policies, but that's a whole nother level. You know, I think people really had some disdain for him, and I say this because that just goes to show you how fast the tables turn. Like I said, because I don't think British people or UK people really realize sort of. Well, I guess they do sort of realize, but when we think of Blair in America, he defined what we thought of as England in the late '90s, early 2000s. I mean, somebody would say Britain, and they instantly thought of Tony Blair. They didn't think of the Queen. They didn't think of any of this other stuff. They thought of Tony Blair, and his rolling around and his weirdo look and the Bond films and all this other stuff. They thought of Tony Blair, and he is now. They don't like him there anymore. And I don't blame them. He's been a loudmouth since he's been out of office and this and that. But you know, when we talk about, because I'm as a geographer, I'm very interested in identity and how people perceive themselves. So, when we talk about eras ending, that means what does the new Britain look like? What does Britain post Blair look like? Well, it looks like a cluster. Okay. And not to say that it wasn't a cluster under Blair, but now you got a conservative party that hates its voters. that wanted to remain but had to have the vote to keep its coalition together. And now half of its party doesn't like them. And now the Labour Party under Blair that acted like it was anti-Brexit is now half of its party's coming around to the idea because there's a lot of working class Labour supporters who want to Brexit as well. So it's so weird. We don't have a unified picture of the UK, much like it looks like the US under Trump no longer has a unified, uniform picture of what people think of it. Whereas it did look for a little while after September 11th under Bush, we had a more unifying picture. And then again in the first year under Obama, it looked like we had a more unifying picture of what America was going to look like. But ever since Trump has gotten elected, and I don't see it getting any better, frankly, we look like a country on the verge of another civil war, and I don't really know what can stop that, because we had a lot of great compromises before our first civil war, and we still had to have the civil war. It just there was no avoiding it. So yeah, ends of eras, they happen all over the place, and of course in France they're having these giant riots in Paris. So it does appear that I don't really. Some people say France has been kind of, in my opinion, in decline since the end of World War II. It just is not. It's never the power that it was pre World War II or pre World War One, for that matter. But it really does. It looks shabby now. If there was any kind of recovery happening in France, if France was getting better as part of the EU and some of its reforms, since Macron has taken over, a lot of people thought, well, France won the World Cup, this would be a rejuvenation. It's only highlighted the great inequality in France. And these riots have just gotten worse and worse. And, the terrorist attacks, we can blame the terrorist attacks on the terrorists. I'm not trying to say that didn't happen. But it has been proven a lot of these people were linked to poor backgrounds growing up in the squalor in the slums of France. And it's just crazy. It's France does not look like a country putting out, famous artists or where people learn to paint or learn more about literature or learn more about, they have debates on morality and, philosophers. France does not appear that way anymore. France really appears in shambles and fractured. So I don't know what to tell you. It looks like the results of the ends of all these eras is fractured nations. If somebody has sort of a counter argument for me, I'm more than welcome to hear it. So thank you all for listening, and keep listening to my podcast. It's been great so far. Thanks.